So this is the last few topics of chapter 1 which we could not cover because of my absence. Now in this slide, if you look at it, the first compound of carbon is having all single bonds. That means carbon can make compounds with all single bonds, and we have understood that compounds containing all single bonds, they contain only sigma type of bonds. The second compound, carbon, is having one double bond with another compound. And we also have learned that whenever there are multiple bonds, one of the bond is a sigma bond and rest of the bonds are pi. So we can say overall in this compound, in the second compound named ethylene, there are total of 5 sigma bonds and there is 1 pi bond. If you think about around each carbon, there are 3 sigma bonds and 1 pi bond. The third compound is acetylene, which contains a carbon-carbon triple bond. So we can say out of the triple bonds, out of the 3 bonds here, one of the bond is sigma type and rest of the bonds are pi. Now counting the number of electron domains, we can also predict bond angles as well as the hybridizations, which we have already understood in previous lecture. Now if you look carefully, the carbon-carbon bonds, they do not have the same strength and the same length. The carbon-carbon single bond is actually the longest bond if you look into the bond length of the carbon-carbon single bond. And the carbon-carbon double bond is shorter and carbon-carbon triple bond is even shorter. Similarly, carbon-carbon single bond is the weakest bond, carbon-carbon double bond is stronger than that, and carbon-carbon triple bond is even stronger, which is obvious. As the bond order, as the number of bonds between the two carbon atoms increases, the bond will get stronger and the bond will get shorter. So we can have a generalization: as a bond gets stronger, the bond becomes shorter or tighter. So this is obvious. If you have more number of bonds between two atoms, that's going to be a stronger bond and that bond will be shorter. But interesting thing is the carbon-hydrogen bond. So if you look into the first compound, the carbon-hydrogen bonds, they have bond length of 111.4 picometer. In the second compound, which contains carbon-hydrogen single bond, the bond length has decreased to 110 picometer. And in the third compound, the carbon-hydrogen bond lengths have decreased even further. If you compare their bond strength, you observe the same thing. In the first compound, the carbon-hydrogen bonds are the weakest with minimum amount of bond strength. In the second compound, it is stronger, and in the third compound, carbon-hydrogen bonds are even stronger. So this is interesting. Even though all these carbon-hydrogen bonds are single bonds, some of them are pretty strong and short, and the other carbon-hydrogen bonds are comparatively weaker and longer. To understand that, we need to figure out what orbitals are involved to overlap and create the carbon-hydrogen single bonds. For example, in the first compound, the carbon atoms are single bonded. So the carbon atom here is sp3 hybridized. Hydrogen cannot have hybridization, so it is 1s. That means to create this carbon-hydrogen bond, to create the bond between the carbon and hydrogen in the first molecule, it is going to have overlap between sp3 orbital from carbon with 1s orbital from hydrogen. In the second case, the carbon-hydrogen bonds are created by sp2 hybrid orbitals from carbon with 1s orbital. And in the third case, the carbon-hydrogen bonds are created by overlapping sp orbitals from carbon with 1s orbitals from hydrogen. So the hydrogen orbital is same in each of these different cases because hydrogen cannot have anything other than 1s, but the orbital on carbon is changing. So we can make a generalization: as the amount of s is increasing from sp3 to sp2 to sp, the bond is getting stronger and the bond is getting shorter. So we can say as the amount of s increases in hybridization scheme, the bond will get stronger and shorter. So to understand that, we can think of something called S character. Now if you look into sp3 hybridization, which is formed by mixing one s orbital with three of the p orbital. So 1/4 of the orbital is coming from s, or 1/4 of the orbitals are of s character. So we can say the s character in sp3 hybridization is 1/4 or 25%. Similarly, in sp2, one s orbital is overlapped or mixed with 2 of the p orbitals. That means 1/3 of the orbitals are coming from the s type of orbital. So there is a 33% or 1/3 s character. For sp hybridization, half of the orbital is of s nature, 50%, and the rest of the half of the orbital is of p nature, which is again 50%. So that's the way we can figure out the S character, and we can say, looking at the last slide, as you go from sp3 to sp2 to sp, amount of S character is increasing, and that's why the bond is getting stronger and shorter. So that is the idea behind figuring out different types of carbon-hydrogen single bonds. So let's see if we can use this principle to solve a problem like this. I have a compound where several of the bonds are identified. For example, bond A, bond B, and bond C. I need to figure out of these three bonds which is the strongest, which is the weakest, as well as I need to figure out the order of their length. So the first question here is asking you to arrange these bonds according to increasing length. So we need to start from the shortest bond and we need to go to the longest bond, or in other words, we need to start from the weakest bond and we need to go to the strongest bond. So to do that, we have to basically write down the S and P character. So if you look into the first bond, which is formed by sp2, or the bond labeled A is formed by sp2 carbon and 1 S hydrogen. The second bond B is formed by sp3 of carbon and 1 S of hydrogen, and the last bond C is formed by sp of carbon to overlap with 1 S of hydrogen. As in case of bond C, you have the most amount of S character, 50%, that bond will be the strongest bond, and the other bond, bond B, that has the least amount of S character, will be the weakest bond. Similarly, we can say as C is the strongest, it's going to be the shortest bond, and B will be the longest bond. So that is the relation between the different bonds that we have here and their length. So basically, we are answering this question by figuring out the hybridization of the two atoms that are overlapping to create a covalent bond. Now let's see if we have a similar question, but this time we have carbon-carbon bonds, but the idea is same. There are 4 bonds that are labeled A, B, C, and D. A, B, C, and D, and we need to figure out how to identify these bonds as the strongest, as the weakest to strongest. So to answer these questions, we have to again look into the orbitals that are overlapping to create the bonds, and then we can figure out which bond has the highest amount of S character. So again, let's figure that out. In case of bond A is formed by overlapping 2 carbons that are double bonded. So we can say the carbons are using their sp2 orbitals to create the bond between the 2 double bonded carbons, or the bond labeled A. Bond B is formed by 2 single bonded carbons. So both of those carbons are utilizing the sp3 hybridization. Bond C is between a triple bonded and a double bonded carbon. So the double bonded carbon is using sp2 hybridization, and the triple bonded carbon is using sp hybridization. In bond D, it is between a double bonded carbon and a single bonded carbon. So the double bonded carbon is using sp2 hybrid orbital, and the single bonded carbon is using sp3 hybrid orbital. Now if you analyze the S characters, you will see that bond B utilizes minimum amount of S character because both carbons are sp3 hybridized. Bond D utilizes little bit more S character because one of the carbon is sp2. Bond A utilizes even more S character because both of the carbon atoms are sp2 hybridized, and bond C utilizes most amount of S character as one of the carbon is sp2, the other carbon is sp. So we can say bond B will be the weakest bond and it is the longest bond, and bond C will be the shortest bond as well as the strongest bond. So we can answer whether the bonds are stronger or weaker, shorter or longer, by analyzing what orbitals are involved to create that bond. Higher the S character, stronger the bond, and shorter the bond. Hope this made some sense.